Awesome. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get things kicked off. Good morning, everybody. Thank you all for joining us. For those of you that are here live, we're going to go ahead and get started. And welcome to today's webinar on building safer tree care operations. We're going to have some fun today, and hopefully you guys can take away some valuable information as well. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Greg Johnston, and I manage the Granite Insurance Tree Care Program. And joining us today is Mr. Dylan Ruhl, who is a loss control expert and agency partner of ours. And Dylan really helps our clients build stronger and safer day-to-day operations. Dylan, do you want to take a minute to just kind of introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. So again, my name is Dylan Ruhl. Thanks, Greg, for having me here today. I'm a senior safety consultant with Keystone's Risk Management Division, and I specialize in a variety of different industries. But the one that you care about today is my work with arborists.
Awesome. And guys, before we kind of dive in, I want to quickly frame what this conversation is really about. And our main objective is to help you guys, the tree care operators, improve and control your insurance results by improving how you operate within the field. And specifically, we want to start to control outcomes. So what do I mean by outcomes? Fewer claims, fewer losses, fewer worker injuries, and just a safer and more efficient job site for everybody involved. And if we can start to control those outcomes, we can also start to control perceptions. So how do underwriters look at you? How do insurance companies look at you? How do regulators like OSHA and DOT view you? How do your own customers view you? Do they view you as somebody that's volatile or more so controlled? And if we can start to control outcomes and perceptions, we can also start to control things like cost, growth, and overall business viability. But before we can get started on all of those results, it all starts with how you operate on a daily basis, which is what we're going to be going over here today. So with all that being said, I'm going to pass the torch over to Dylan, and we can dive into the details.
Thanks, Greg. Yeah, at the end of the day, tree care is one of the most hazardous trades in this country. And a lot of these injuries and deaths that are seen in this industry, at the end of the day, they are preventable. We're going to talk about some of the ways that you can mitigate those risks and hopefully prevent serious injuries and even fatalities on your sites. And we're going to move through 6 sections. There's a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to keep things tight and short, but we will have time for questions at the end, and I encourage you to stop me if anything comes up along the way. So what are we covering today? We'll start with the stakes. Why tree care ranks where it does for workplace fatalities, and what the data actually shows. Then we'll move into the OSHA standards that apply directly to your work, with a focus on the ones that get people cited the most often. From there, we'll get into pre-work hazard assessments, which really should start at your estimation, just the beginnings before you even head out to the job. The single highest leverage thing your operation can do are these pre-work hazard assessments, followed by personal protective equipment, or PPE, selection, tailgate talks, or as they're known in the construction industry, toolbox talks, and how to build the kind of daily habits that crews will self-enforce when you're not there. We'll close out with incident reporting and near-miss culture, and then I'll give you 5 concrete actions to take back with you before we open it up for question and answer. So let's start with the reason that we're in this room. Tree care isn't a desk job. You don't get to work remotely. You don't get to sit at a desk in your nice warm house. You're working at height. You're working near power lines with cutting equipment in variable conditions. There's slippery grass. Sorry, I almost said glass. Hopefully there isn't glass on your site, but there might be. There's slippery grass, mud, dirt. There might even be some critters. There might be groundhogs. There might be things that you're dealing with that we can't even think of. But these hazards are real. They're daily, and they compound quickly when your crew isn't prepared for them. So this section is about making the case with data for why everything else we talk about today matters. 50 fatalities in tree care and groundskeeping, a 4 times higher fatality rate. These numbers are scary. And how does this happen? Well, it's consistently ranked as the #1 most hazardous trade in the agriculture and forestry industries. Not near the top, at the top. So again, we're looking at roughly 50 fatalities a year across tree care and groundskeeping operations. And it's 4 times the average across all private sector jobs. It's not a rounding error, that's a structural problem. but it's one that can be fixed. It's one that can, if not be fixed, at least mitigated to the point where people are safe. And how does this happen? Well, contact with energized lines, falls from height, struck by falling limbs or equipment, and caught in or by equipment. None of that should be a surprise. It's probably the things that keep you up at night, thinking about crews going into drop zones where they shouldn't be, thinking about a rope failure, thinking about a harness failure or a knot failure. These are all, things that can make things, putting it mildly, go bad. So what separates safe crews? Well, I want you to look at both sides of this slide. The left column is not a list of bad actors. These are behaviors that develop naturally in operations where safety culture isn't intentionally built and maintained. Skipping the site assessment because you've done this job 100 times. Inconsistent personal protective equipment because nobody pushed back or nobody enforced it. No formal training because everyone kind of already knows the drill. We've been doing this for 30 years. I don't need another training. The right column is not complicated, but it's consistent, it's documented, and most importantly, it needs to be led from the top. If ownership or management doesn't, buy in, doesn't enforce it, doesn't act like they believe in what's coming out of their mouth, it's a problem. So the gap between these two columns at the end of the day isn't training, it's habits, and dare I say it, behavior. When you have decentralized crews, when you have multiple crews out on site and you as the business owner or you as the manager aren't there to supervise, it kind of comes down to like parenting with kids. At some point you got to let them out of the house. At some point you got to let them go and grow and make mistakes. But you have to build that foundation of trust before you let them go out into the field, before you let them go to kindergarten. Again, that's me speaking personally. I've got a 5-year-old at home. But with that, you have to instill good habits and you have to hire people that you trust. You have to hire people that you can trust will go to somebody's home and act safely. Right? So next, what are the OSHA standards? There's no way to sugarcoat this. This is not about memorizing these CFR numbers, these regulation numbers. It's not about being able to spout off what the distances are, what the certain nitty-gritty things are within these regulations. That's my job. It's the most boring part of my job is having to spout off regulations. And even I have to look these regulations up from time to time. I don't have these memorized. And you don't need to either. But the basics, you need to know the basics. So up front, what is your Bible? What are the things that you should be looking at? Well, it's 1910. Looking at the next slide. So some of the electrical stuff, the vehicle mounted elevating and rotating platforms. And then lastly, what really should be the framework for everything that you do is the ANSI Z133 standard, which is the tree care operations safety standard. While the OSHA stuff is going to comparatively cover things in a really generic way, just for all general industry clients. So basically you have to follow the same OSHA regulation that a factory does. I've got a metal roofing manufacturer. They have to follow the same rules for aerial lifts that you do. Where it gets more industry specific is the ANSI Z133. So it's going to specifically call out industry specific PPE requirements, chainsaw handling and cut technique standards, rigging system load requirements, and then some tailgate talk or toolbox talk and communication protocols. Okay. So again, this one here on the right is really what you need to focus on. That being said, you can still get cited for everything within the OSHA standard. So it's complex, there's a lot to it, but we're here to help with any questions that you might have. Now, again, talking about boring stuff, the nitty-gritty, the paperwork things, One of the most common areas that I see clients lacking when I first start to work with them, because just to kind of frame my job isn't just doing webinars day in and day out. I get to leave this office, as nice as it is. I go out in the field, I build relationships with clients, I work with them on a monthly basis. Sometimes I'm there weekly. But basically, I really get to know these people, and I do all of the things that I'm outlining and presenting here for them. That's a service that, Keystone's Risk Management Division provides. So one of the first things that we see when we start working with a new account is often this OSHA 300 log thing. Okay, you say, "Hey, where are your OSHA 300 logs?" And they look at you with a deer in the headlights look. So the OSHA 300 log is a log of anything above a first aid incident. So if you have to report it to workers' comp, chances are it's OSHA recordable. Okay. There's some intricacies there, which we'll get into in a coming slide, but this is the basics. Okay. So February 1st, you need to post the OSHA 300A summary in a visible workplace location. When we say the log includes employees' names, but the summary does not. Okay. On March 1st, you should have submitted your 300A electronically. This is required for employers with 20 or more employees in a high hazard industry, of which, if you're on this call, you absolutely fall into. And that is submitted via OSHA's injury tracking application, or ITA. So if you haven't done that, here we are sitting at April 1st. It's April Fool's Day. Don't hesitate to give me a call, and I would be happy to walk you through both creating an OSHA log and then submitting it electronically. And again, that is going to be for employers that are at 20 or more employees. Okay? This next one, you hope you never have to make this call. Okay? It's going to be the worst day of your life. You don't want to make a bad situation worse by getting a stupid citation on top of everything. So while you're dealing with the grief, while you're dealing with calling a family member or an emergency contact, unfortunately, you need to remember that you need to call OSHA. Okay? And that's going to be really annoying. You're going to look at it, you're going to want to blow it off. It's going to be the last thing you want to do. But there is mandatory reporting from an OSHA standpoint, and they need to be made aware of an incident like this within 8 hours, or they will fine you. Chances are, if somebody died, something went really wrong, and when you report that fatality, OSHA is probably going to find something to cite you for. So you don't want to add to that by, getting cited just for not calling. The next one is the severe injuries. These would be inpatient hospitalizations, amputations, or loss of an eye. They're a little bit more relaxed with this, but they need to be reported within 24 hours. Okay? So these are kind of the generic, quick hitter things for OSHA expectations on 300 logs. There's some intricacies to this. I want you to know that, you can call me if you have questions, if you run into any issues specific to this. But for instance, with the inpatient hospitalizations, if it's just for observation, like if somebody has a concussion and they get admitted overnight just for observation to make sure they're okay, you don't have to call. But if it's inpatient hospitalization and they're, putting a wound vac in or their surgery, absolutely, you're going to need to call. So in any event, we could do an entire webinar just on OSHA 300 compliance alone. So I'm going to move on to the next thing. But again, if you have any questions, don't hesitate to use the chat. Okay. The next couple of topics that show up repeatedly in OSHA citations for tree care operations are going to be fall protection. Okay. Now, the trigger height in general industry, which you fall into, is 4 feet. Right. So anytime you are above 4 feet, you are to be tied off or protected in some manner. So that can be a harness with a rope. That can be a lanyard attached to an aerial lift. But aerial lift is going to require a full body harness. Okay. not just a climbing harness. So that's kind of an intricacy with arborists. I believe that they make combo harnesses. My clients do not use those. They just switch out harnesses because they don't like the idea of changing. They like their climbing harness. And then essentially they put up with the full body harness that goes in the aerial lift, just being honest. One is definitely more comfortable than the other. I get that. But you need to be tied off anytime you're inside the bucket. Okay. And when I say aerial lift, that also includes a bucket truck. The next thing you need to be aware of is a rescue plan. Okay. So if something happens and somebody falls out of that basket, you need to have a way to get them out. And then lastly, within fall protection, you need to inspect that equipment and you need to remove it from service if it has any damages whatsoever. The next part, machine guarding and lockout tagout. This really comes into some really disgusting and gross accidents involving wood chippers and stump grinders. But basically, if you're going to be working on or clearing a jam in any of these machines, you need to make sure that lockout tagout is applied. Basically, that the employee can't get sucked in and hurt, right? One of the worst parts of this is having ropes on the ground. They get caught in a limb, and then the limb goes in the chipper, and then the rope literally pulls the person in. I'll never forget the first time I was doing research on this and watched a video where the rope was pulled in. Now, the rope had a dummy attached to it. It looked like a cartoon to me. Just like watching that video, it looked to me like something that somebody had manipulated and sped up. And I watched it 5 or 6 times, and I'm talking to a coworker about this, and he's shaking his head. He's like, no, Dylan, that's how fast that auger, that device inside moves. And it's like, man, you barely have time to react. Just, bam, 1 minute, your rope's grabbed and you're getting sucked at this thing. So that's the idea here behind machine guarding, lockout, tagout, and all those trainings. So what are the most cited violations? None of this should come as a surprise. Electrical hazard clearances are going to be the first one, followed by fall protection. Next one's going to be PPE. I get it. I'm a human being. I'm not just a safety professional. I have a chainsaw. I have chaps. I'll be honest, I shouldn't admit this on a recorded webinar, but the chaps don't always come out. I get that in your personal life. I understand that. The justification for me is always, well, it's just a small branch. It's just a small thing. And for me, I'm doing trail work. I'm a mountain biker. So I'm riding back in, and I don't want to take the chaps in my backpack too. It's a pain in the butt. In our personal lives, we make decisions. In our professional lives, we have to understand that our decisions have consequences, and we have to hold ourselves to a higher standard. So we need to make sure that we're wearing that PPE. The next one is hazard communication. What the heck is hazard communication? Safety data sheets in a nutshell. For those of us that are old enough to remember, MSDS sheets. MSDS sheets are basically for any chemicals that you might use, any sort of pesticides, any sort of things that you're spraying. You need to make sure that you have SDS sheets and that you're training people on the chemicals that you're using. And then lockout, tagout, we already talked about that. Clearing jams, working on equipment, that's going to be one of the other most cited. Okay. So the next section I want to talk about is these pre-work hazard assessments. We've heard this a million times. I've heard it a million times. We have a client management system that we use, and we're supposed to document all of our activities. And my first boss here, always said, if you didn't document it, it didn't happen. That's true of client management systems. Greg, it's probably true of your client management system too, if you're prospecting. If you don't put it in the system, Cameron doesn't think it happened, right? So, yeah. So with that, we need to treat our pre-work hazard assessments the same. OSHA's not going to take your word. An attorney is certainly not going to take your word, and the insurance people aren't going to take your word for it. There's a lack of trust here that leads to documentation. So what should we be looking at from a site walk protocol perspective? We should always be identifying utilities. Okay, call 811, mark lines visibly on site. If you're getting into anything involving overhead or underground utilities, you need to make sure that you know where they are, even if you're driving equipment over it. One item of note here that I didn't capture in the PowerPoint directly, but I just want to say it conversationally. Homeowners will often go rogue and do their own thing. A short conversation with the homeowner about what is on their property can go a very long way. Now, I know that you aren't often going to be digging ditches or digging into the ground, but it does occasionally happen. And you don't want to be the one that cut the Cat 6 Ethernet line that runs the internet in the guy's barn, and then has to strand together that cable, or worse, a fiber optic cable, because you happen to hit it with a shovel. So a conversation can go a long way. The next one is establishing drop zones. Okay, we could do an entire webinar on drop zone safety. And one of the worst accidents that they weren't a client at the time, but I came in after the fact. But one of the worst accidents that I'm aware of involved drop zone discipline. Okay. So with that being said, just establishing those drop zones and making sure that everybody stays out. The next one is assessing structural hazards. You guys as arborists are always going to be way better at this than I will ever be. So I'm just covering this at a super, super high level. But you know what you're looking for. You're looking for decay. You're looking for bark that looks off, cracks, codominant stems, flagging, or just remembering where the high-risk limbs are before climbing begins, and just developing a plan of how you're going to get that tree down. You have to assess those structural hazards. The next thing you're going to do, you absolutely have to make sure to identify the electrical hazards on site, and plan out for that. If you're going to be near a road, if you're going to be on a road, you need to establish traffic and public control. I understand that for the people on this call today, the states that you operate in all require certified flaggers. Okay, so if you are setting up cones, if you are setting up a stop slow paddle or a flag, anybody that's doing that needs to be certified. And I'll tell you, the certifications are boring. It's a 4-hour-long course in some instances. Up here in Pennsylvania, it's a little bit shorter. But when I was doing a little bit of research, it seems like the southern ones really, drive it home over a 4-hour period. But you got to do it. And so much of that comes down to just appropriately setting up cones, appropriately setting up signage. I almost hit a tree crew in my personal vehicle coming up over a hill. I was not speeding. I was going the speed limit. And I came up over a hill, and then all of a sudden, boom, there's a bucket truck in front of me. There were no cones. There were no signs previous, up the hill. All these guys would have had to do, and it wouldn't have been compliant at this point, but it would have been something. All these guys would have had to do is just put a simple sign up top, and I would have known to, watch what's coming, know what's coming up ahead. And then lastly, just documenting and briefing the crew. Okay. So what does the assessment need to cover? You can see it here. The job site address and date, are the utilities identified, drop zones established. Basically, you want to give yourself a checklist. And this is non-negotiable, because if something happens and OSHA comes out, they're going to want to see this. If you get involved in a lawsuit, they're going to want to see this. Post-incident review, they're going to want to see this. And then lastly, the insurance people, they're also going to want to see this. So I threw this together just from like a formatting standpoint to be in a PowerPoint. It's a little short, I wouldn't necessarily don't go taking a picture of this and use this exact document, but this fit nicely on the PowerPoint, so I wanted to share just this document. But basically, you've got 12 checkboxes here. You've got a job site name, that can just be the address. You've got a date, you've got a lead, you've got the weather, and then you've got signatures at the bottom. Fill this out, put it in a book, do it digitally, however you want to do it. You just have something here that's documented to make sure that everybody understands, that we addressed these hazards. Okay. So the next thing I want to talk about is personal protective equipment and tailgate talks. Okay. So from a PPE standpoint, cut-resistant chainsaw chaps. These things are amazing tools. And the last safety committee I was at with one of my arborist clients, they had to buy a new pair of chainsaw chaps because one of the guys was not really watching where he was going, and it cut him right in the thigh. Now, I am getting my first aid CPR AED instructor certification, so I'm well aware of where arteries are in the body, and my eyes went awfully wide when they showed me where the cut was. Because if he had not been wearing the chaps, we'd have been in a problem because he was right near the femoral artery, right? And all of the other, PPE, the face shields, the hard hats, your climbing saddle harnesses, friction hitches, mechanical devices. These are all the types of PPE that we expect you to be using out in the field, right? A lot of these we've already talked about, so I'm going to go through this slide kind of quickly. But again, full body harness if you're in an aerial lift. And then if you are working near energized lines, some of the electrical specific personal protective equipment items here. Okay. So how do we structure the tailgate talk or the toolbox talk? Well, basically we start with the site hazards. We review those assessment findings. We talk about who is doing what and who is not to be in the drop zone. We talk about PPE. If it's different, if it's a little unique. We talk about a comms plan. How are we going to communicate? Are we going to use radio? Who has stop work authority? Are we going to use hand signals? How are you communicating with your guys? And then lastly, ideally, you sign and date a document that says you went through this tailgate talk with everybody. Okay. All of that documentation just helps you in the event of a lawsuit or an OSHA inspection. Okay? Now, why does safety fail? Rules enforced by supervisors create compliance, but not culture. Crews comply when watched and cut corners when they're not. If a crew member doesn't feel responsible for each other's safety, the system's going to break down the moment a supervisor is absent. If somebody's inconsistent or near misses go unreported, the crew never learns. That's the bad side. That's in red. What actually builds the habit? Train crews to call each other out in a kind way. Don't just go up the chain. Normalize crew members stopping that unsafe work themselves, saying, hey, Greg, your face shield's up. Put it down before you keep cutting. Okay? Chris, make sure to do that too. Okay? You forgot your gloves today. Here's my spare set. Please use these. Have that compliance, but peer accountability. Visible leadership. This one made me laugh a little bit when I was doing this because I'll never forget a scrap metal recycling yard that I worked with when I first started with this job. The owner was the absolute worst one on the site. He would climb up a bale of metal, and he was a poor example of safety. And yet he'd sit in the safety meeting and say, you need to do this. You need to lead by example. And you need to have consistent enforcement. And we need to recognize people that have done a good job with safety and continue to do a good job with safety. So again, this incident reporting and near miss culture, we talked about the OSHA logs. We need to understand, what is recordable, We need to understand these reporting timelines. We need to make sure that injuries get reported in a timely manner. It's one of the easiest ways for an insurance company to deny your claim if you don't follow a good, quick reporting structure. So make sure you have the forms, make sure you have this all ready to go so that if somebody gets hurt, you get it to your workers' comp provider in a timely fashion. Okay? The next part, building a near miss culture. What does that mean? Well, for every fatality, for every serious injury, there are going to be hundreds of near misses that went unreported. So what does that mean? Hundreds. That's what that means. You have a ton of operations, or a ton of opportunities, I should say, to address unsafe actions. And we do this by having safety meetings with the group, with the committee every month. And when we do that committee meeting, the most common question I ask is, what's the most dangerous thing you had to do in the last 30 days? And at least with my arborist accounts, it's often a story about a limb falling unexpectedly, a saw kicking back and missing them, an aerial lift rocking on uneven ground. Basically, if anybody says, oh, that was close, that's a near miss, and you want to document that and discuss it. And you never want to make it so that somebody feels guilty for bringing a near miss up, okay? If somebody is penalized for bringing up a near miss, this culture is done, okay? You need to be able to talk about mistakes in a clear and controlled manner. Keep your temper. If somebody says, hey, I made a cut without chaps, why did you make a cut without chaps? Okay, have that discussion. If they do it 2 or 3 times, then we talk about discipline, okay? But you need to have that culture of talking and, just going through these things with people, okay? So the first 24 hours after a crew injury, you're going to want to secure the scene. You're going to want to render first aid, call 911, notify your supervisor/company leadership. Make sure to do these notifications. We talked about the OSHA fatality and severe injury time requirements. Make sure to call your agent, notify legal counsel if the severity warrants it, and then employee support for HR should you have an HR person. Okay. Just all this assessing of the reporting obligations we can help you with, and then the documentation and initial review. Again, we are here to help you. Okay. So some of the key takeaways as we close this up: implementing a written pre-work hazard assessment, enforcing electrical hazard clearances, formalizing daily or even weekly tailgate talks, building a near-miss reporting program, and conducting annual PPE audits by task to make sure that you are good to go, okay? Making sure that all of the PPE is still intact. That needs to happen on a daily basis. If it's cut, if it gets grazed by a chainsaw, that harness or that rope, no good, no longer, okay? So what are your resources that can help you? Well, other than myself, my number's down here at the bottom. Feel free to call me should you have any questions. The OSHA Tree Care e-tool is available to you. That's nice. The ANSI Z133 standard, again, should act as your Bible for a lot of things. The OSHA ITA, which is that 300A submission for clients with greater than 20 employees, 20 or greater employees. 811 before you dig. And then lastly, the Tree Care Industry Association, okay? They've got a robust library of safety resources, and I believe they also give you free access if you're a member to the ANSI Z133 standard. So that's a nice way of not having to pay for that, I think it's 100-something pages long standard. So those are the resources. Again, you now have me as a resource. If you have any questions, now is the time to bring those questions up.
Dylan, I wanted to ask kind of a more of a thought-provoking question, hopefully bring these concepts home for everybody listening. So, like, if you walked onto a random job site today, what would be the first three things that you would look at to tell whether, hey, this company has everything controlled and they have control of their operations and their workers, or you look at these three things and you say, hey, these guys don't know what they're doing. Like, what would those three things be?
Top three. Okay. So I'm going to frame everything that I do on this stuff. Okay. The fall protection. I'm going to go over and I'm going to look at the harness on the guy. I'm going to look at the rope he's using. I'm going to look at the mechanical or knots that he's utilizing. And I'm going to make sure that everything is good to go. I know number one says electrical hazard clearances, but really for me, the first thing I'm going to go to is fall protection. That kind of goes hand in hand with PPE. So looking at the harness, that's a form of PPE. I'm going to look at the hard hat. I'm going to look at the face shield. Um, you know, One good note, and Tori, I see you put something in the chat. You raise a really good point. Face shields and safety glasses are recommended, especially with a chainsaw. So the problem with kind of the steel ones, STIHL, not STEL, the brand. The problem with those mesh guards is they can still let stuff through. So the face shield that pops down works great, but it's not enough. You want the safety glasses on in addition to that. On the flip side, which I think, Tori, that was your question, even if a crew wears safety glasses, do they still need face shields as well? Yes. Yeah, you should have face shields for most tasks. Now, that's for cutting. I would say for your regular crew that's, clearing limbs and getting stuff into the chipper, safety glasses would be totally fine. But for somebody that's operating a saw, you'd want a face shield and safety glasses underneath. Right? I hope that answers your question. If it doesn't, feel free to unmute yourself. The next thing I'd be looking at would be the electrical hazard clearances. And just, how's the crew operating? So much of this stuff can't really be written down. So much of this stuff is just like, what's my gut feeling? Like looking at an employee, are they, for lack of a better term, sketchy? If an employee's sketchy and not paying attention and walking where they shouldn't be, business owner and I are going to have a conversation. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question, Greg.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely.
All right.
And Dylan, I've got one more just to kind of round out kind of all this material, make it a little bit more digestible for the audience. If a tree company could prioritize one thing over the next 30 days that could, materially reduce their risk, what would that be? What should they be working on if you could choose one thing to better round out their operations?
If you got to choose something here, that written pre-work hazard assessment, if you're going to do one thing, do that. All right. Do we have any other questions from the participants today? Oh, yeah, great. Yeah, great point. Yeah. So even if it's a fatality not caused by error, such as a heart, by error. Hold on. Tori, can you unmute yourself? If you don't have a mic, it's okay. What do you mean by an error? Because if it's a heart attack,
Yeah, Dylan, I think she can't unmute herself, but I think what she's asking is, somebody's working and they have a heart attack on the job site, and it's not, there's a fatality not due to any workmanship error. How does that need to be handled? Kind of the same way, I would assume.
Paul, honestly, I'm going to give you the really crappy consultant response, and I only pull this out when I absolutely have to because I hate it. It depends. If you have, especially with a heart attack for this industry, we should have a conversation about what happened leading up to it. In other industries, like I'll use my metal roofing manufacturer. If somebody has a heart attack on the production floor, we're absolutely not calling OSHA for that. Okay. The problem with arborists is that your work is way more physically demanding than a factory job. So an argument could almost be made that, like, especially if the individual was climbing, they could try and spin that and make that work related. So again, I'm giving you the crappy consultant answer of it depends. If that happens, call your agent, call my number, we'll have a conversation, and I can help you make that determination. Heart attacks are tough. That's a good question, Tori. Good job stumping the safety guy in front of everybody. I hate using that. It depends, you know. Okay, so again, the heart attack thing is something I would advise you to consult with me on. You know, if somebody's just walking around a site and they have a heart attack and they pass away, you would not need to report that under most circumstances. If they're climbing a tree, it becomes a little bit of a gray area. So again, I have to just give you the answer of it depends for that. I can't give you a direct yes or no. Not something we caused or the crew caused to happen. Yeah, I get that part for sure. But it's very circumstantial. It's not a simple answer. And then in terms of documenting the tailgate meetings, can the admin hold on to them? Yeah, so Tori, you can keep those in the office. That's fine. If that's what you mean by admin. Yeah. Yeah, I don't expect your guys to have binders and binders of tailgate meetings in the trucks. They got enough equipment to carry around.
Tori, one thing I would say to have the crews keep in the trucks is incident reports. Some sort of form that you can record documented injuries, any third party claims, is, if you guys drop a tree on the house, just to kind of capture the facts about what actually happened so that it's written and it's documented. That's what I would kind of keep in the trucks and just easily accessible to the crew.
Any other questions, Tori, or anyone else that's on the call? You're welcome.
Perfect.
Okay. All right. With that being said, we are going to close this down. Greg, just hang on one second. Tori, have a great day, and our other participants, thank you.